You know, as a graduating senior from high school, I had to fill out those college applications, and mine actually looked pretty impressive because when it would ask for class rank, I was able to put number 8. How many of you would think it's pretty impressive to be number 8 in your graduating class? Now, it's pretty impressive if your graduating class is 1,000. It's not very impressive when your graduating class is 15. So I have the unique place of being in the upper 50% and lower 50% of my class. So if there's a statistic that kind of summarizes what it was like for me as a kid, that statistic right there kind of sums it up. I was just simply average. And I always viewed myself probably as below average. In fact, probably one of the more anxious times of my life was always recess. It was great because I was able to take a break from my mediocre academic career. But at the same time, I knew that we were going to pick up teams. And whatever sport it was that we were going to play, somebody's like, I wouldn't be captain, another person, I'd be captain. And if I wasn't captain, I knew what would happen. That this classroom, this playground ritual would kind of take place of being chosen. Now, I'll tell you, I was never chosen last. But when I was chosen, it was kind of like, it's not necessarily that I was wanted, it was more that I was better than the people that were wanted less than me. And so anytime that the choosing would happen, I would start to kind of have that, I don't know if I can breathe, sort of thing, and my heart would race. And I had this, I knew, I was like, I need to show on my face that I don't care. Don't look needy, act like you don't care, don't have eye contact, all that sort of thing. All that going on, and then breathe a sigh of relief when I wasn't last. Anybody know what I'm talking about? You know what it's like to be chosen last, or maybe even feel as though you're last, like you really don't matter, that you're last in the eyes of men. If you ever feel that way, you're in good company. You see, in the Old Testament, is the part of the Bible before the life of Jesus, and it pretty much tells the story of God's creation and Israel as a nation. And as Israel was becoming a nation, they started to look at all the other nations around them. And as they were looking at all the other nations around them, they realized that they didn't have a king. All the other nations had a king, and they didn't have a king, so they went to Samuel, and Samuel was this prophet of God. He was kind of the leader of Israel at the time, that he would hear from God, and then he would lead the nation. And they went to Samuel and said, we want a king. And so Samuel goes to God and says, hey, they want a king. And God says, give them a king. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. So they get a king, and this king is Saul, and Saul ends up being really a bad king. So eventually God says, I'm not going to have Saul be my king anymore. I want a man that is after my own heart. So he tells Samuel that he is going to really have a new king, and he's going to be the son of Jesse, and Jesse is from Bethlehem. And so he goes to Bethlehem, and he says, basically, I'm going to tell you which of his sons is going to be king. And as the scenario plays out, Jesse brings his sons, oldest to the youngest, right? And as he brings oldest to the youngest, the very first one shows up. His name is Eliab, and Samuel looks at this guy and goes, that's it, right there. He's got to be king, and God says, not him. You see, I'm able to see the heart, and all man looks at is the exterior, and not him. And so another one, not him. Another one, not him. And finally get down to the 7th of the 8 sons, and basically Samuel goes, do you have any more? And Jesse goes, yeah, there's the youngest, and he's out in the fields with the sheep. Now, I don't know why he didn't bring the youngest. I don't know why he didn't do that, but The very fact of the matter, the youngest was not even invited to the party. Maybe it's because he's youngest. Maybe he just didn't think that he would amount to anything. But Samuel said, bring him in. And as he brings him in, Samuel looks at him and immediately says, that is the one who's to be king. And we know this man as David. David was simply a shepherd boy. But as we will find out in the coming weeks, we know that David became an incredible man of God. Now, over the next several weeks, we're going to kind of discover that sometimes we always kind of look at the Sunday school stories of David, right? And there's some kind of not so safe Sunday school stories of David. And we're actually going to look at some of those as well. I want to ask this. What does it say about you? What does it say about David? That David's dad, when he heard that one of his sons was going to become king, didn't even invite David to the party. And maybe as he's rosy red cheeks, maybe as he's short, maybe he just kind of had that aloofness. Maybe there was something about David that everybody just kind of shook their head. You ever been around that person where you just kind of shake your head? I mean, maybe that was David. I don't know, but one of the things that I can see is David was last in the eyes of men, but he came first in the eyes of God. And so when you kind of feel like, I don't matter or I don't measure up, know this, you are not in the last in the eyes of God. So if you have your Bibles this morning, go ahead and turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. As we turn there, we begin to find out that David was chosen as king. And I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to think about this. If you had been chosen king and there was another king that was still in office, what would you do? How would you go about your daily life? What would you do with the knowledge and the awareness that you're going to be next on the throne? I don't know. I think I'm showing up at the king's palace going, hey, dude, God said I'm supposed to be here. I think I'm setting up the cabinet. I think I'm making my plans to be in office. What does David do? David doesn't form his cabinet. He doesn't go to the king's palace. He goes back to the fields. He goes back to the sheep. He goes back to solitude. And his brothers go off to war. And this kind of provides us the setting of 1 Samuel chapter 17, where Israel, many times before, they were fighting the Philistines. And they were in the valley of Elah. Now, I looked at some pictures of the valley of Elah. And one of the things that it is, it kind of has a slope on one side and a slope on the other. And this valley in the middle, there's a stream moving down the absolute center. And so with this, that's the setting of the battle between the Philistines and Israel. Now, this is a little bit more unique in that the Philistines had an advantage in that they had a single warrior. His name was Goliath. And Goliath, according to biblical measurement, we don't know exactly what that was, they said stood over 9 feet tall. Now, if you want to figure out what 9 feet tall would be, I could have Jim come up here and have me sit on his shoulders. That's what 9 feet tall would be. That's pretty substantial, and it's not just lanky tall. This was big. He was a giant. In fact, his armor alone was 125 pounds. The guy was a stud. Well, one of the things that they would do in ancient world, one of the ways that battle was done, is the kings would get together at the battle lines, and they would say, you get your best warrior, I'll get my best warrior, we'll bring them together, and as we bring them together, we'll let them battle it out, and whoever wins, that's the nation who wins, and the other army is enslaved. So it's very common. It was not very common to have such a disadvantage with a warrior that was as tall as Goliath and as big as Goliath. So for 40 days, as this battle is going on, Goliath comes out, and Goliath, this big old muscle-bound guy, I want somebody to fight, kind of Probably a big dumb jerk kind of guy. And so he comes out there and said, I want to fight somebody. And all of the soldiers of Israel are playing nose goes. Does anybody know what nose goes is? My kids play this at my house. Some of you youth leaders are doing it. Nose goes is when somebody is asked to do something, like I say, go load the dishwasher, and my kids will go, nose goes. And so the last person to put their nose up like that, they're the one that has to do it. So I'll sometimes, if somebody does that, I'll go, you go do it. You did it first. And I'll be dictatorial in that sort of way. But they're just saying, I don't want to do this. Nobody's wanting to do this. So everybody's fearful. This happens for 40 days. And then Jesse says, David, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go check and see on how things are going. So I want you to take some cheese and some bread, take it to the commanders of your brother's army, and go figure out what's happening. So he comes onto the scene and finds an army in fear. Notice verse 24, it says, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. Much afraid. That's probably not a great place to be when you go into battle. But notice what it says in verse 26. It says, and David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Elsewhere, as he is going on, his brothers begin to kind of ridicule him for coming on scene. They belittle him. Just say, go back to the sheep. Go back to those few sheep and leave us alone. You do the shepherding thing. You let us do the battle thing and so on like that. But we find in verses 31 and 32, it says, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. So one of the things that we begin to find out about David is that he approached this battle with absolute confidence. There were thousands of soldiers who were trained in battle who were filled with fear, but this young kid was filled with absolute confidence. And I don't think it's because he was inexperienced. I don't think it was the fact that he just was kind of youthful and didn't know any better. I don't think it was that he was arrogant. I think the fact of the matter, there was something else there that really kind of brought confidence into David's life. And we'll get back to that here in a moment, but let's go ahead and continue to see how this scenario plays out. In verse 33, it says, and Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. Again, people are looking at the exterior and not the interior. They're not looking at the heart. And it goes on. David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, struck him, and delivered it out of the mouth. And if it arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. If you ever want to Netflix anything in heaven, this is probably one of the things I want to Netflix right here. It says, your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. One of the things that I kind of see is that David is approaching this battle with absolute self-awareness. He is able to say, I can do this. I can do this because of what has happened in my life before. I'm able to do this because, listen, there was a time when a bear came and it took a lamb, and I fought the bear, I killed the bear. There was a time a lion came and it took a lamb, and I fought the lion and I killed the lion. There's something in his past that was able to bring about self-awareness in his present. And so that self-awareness of saying, listen, I can do this, it's not ludicrous. It's not outside the realm of David's mind, because he's been in scenarios before where he's saying, I am absolutely ready for this. But as you read on, it says this in verse 38, Then Saul clothed David with his armor, put a helmet of bronze on his head, and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried to in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I can't go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Now, if you're a warrior, and the king gives you his armor, that is an act of honor. That's as if the king is bestowing this great honor upon you that no one else gets. But David, in his self-awareness, realizes, I can't do this. I can't go into battle like this if I've got this extra stuff on me. And part of the reason is that David, what they said, was short. Saul was said to be a head taller than everyone else. Your armor was made specifically for you and your height. And the picture that I get in my mind is baseball. My dad used to coach baseball, and my brother was older and so on like that. So I was that punk kid that just sat in the dugout and kind of hung around and so on. And so when the catcher's gear was not being used, I loved to put on the catcher's gear. But I can remember that, the shin guards that are supposed to come up and like top of your knee actually came up to about right there. And the chest guard that was supposed to come down to your belly, it went down to my knees. And the helmet and the mask that you put on, supposed to be tight on your head. I could pretty much just take that thing and do this over and over and over. And I would walk around, and I think it was so cool that I had all this stuff on, but I probably looked like a full-body dry heave, and that I just couldn't have coordination in this. And I think that David started walking in all this stuff thinking, this is just awkward. This is just not going to work. So he took it off. And so he had the awareness to know that way of doing battle is not the way I need to do battle. And notice what happens. Notice it says in verse 40, Then David took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's pouch. With his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came to David, and with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And that was verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with sword and with spear and with javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Skip on down to verse 48. In verse 48 it says, When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. One of the things that I kind of see here is that David approached this battle unconventionally. Up until this time, there have been times where the sling and the stone had been used in battle. In fact, it talks about this in the book of Judges, that the Benjamites were skilled with the sling. But the sling was something that you would do when the warfare was long distance. So they would take the sling and they would use them as projectiles. The arrows, they said many times, would stick in to the shields that they would shoot with a bow and arrow, but the stones would actually shatter the shield. In fact, by the time the Romans had come along, they had stopped using stones, and they had started using lead balls. And there's actually medical books that they have found that really give people instruction on how to remove lead balls from impaled bodies. So this is pretty hardcore sort of stuff. This is something you do when there is kind of like a grenade. It's a long distance sort of thing. It's not a short distance, but David says this. And I think David knew what worked because David was a shepherd. And when you're a shepherd, you have a lot of time on your hands. And you got your sling, and you got all these stones around, and you got all these sparrows sitting on fence posts. I don't know if that was sparrows or not. Maybe they had tin cans. But he got really good. And he knew what he could do. They actually said that when you think of stone, what do you think about? About like that? What they have found is most often because of archaeology and finding some of the slings, that the stones were probably about this big. This is a pool ball. And that the velocity, and there's people who a whole lot smarter than me that have figured this out, that when these slings are 3 feet long, and that's kind of going, it will probably be what they would say 150 feet per second is how fast that projectile is moving. And if you want to just kind of put this into perspective, if you know baseball, Nolan Ryan could pitch nearly 105 miles an hour. Imagine a pool ball coming at you at 105 miles an hour. How many of you want to get in front of that? This was an unconventional opponent. And David knew that he had to be unconventional in battle. Folks, I want to tell you something. A lot of y'all have been in church a lot of your life, right? I'm half a 90, and I've been in church all my life. I've seen a lot of changes in the church. And I've heard a lot of Christians with a lot of remorse saying, boy, I sure wish church were like it used to be. Anybody ever say that before? You're more than welcome to do that. I've heard a lot of people say, well, we've never done it that way before. Anybody ever said that before? Okay, it's okay if you've said that, and I'm not here to bash you for doing that, but I'm just going to tell you, I've seen a lot of changes in church. I'm sure you've seen a lot of changes in church, but I'm going to tell you that here is the reality. We do not live in the same culture of the 1970s. We don't live in the same culture of the 1950s. We don't. I mean, I've been in ministry since the 1990s. The world has changed tremendously. And so if we live in an unconventional world, we cannot do church in a conventional way and expect to see people come to Christ. We have to be willing to say that this is different and this is new and we've never done this before, but trust that God will work in that. And folks, there's a lot of things I miss in church. But unconventional is good. In fact, let me tell you about my daughter. My daughter is possibly going to Berlin next summer. And I have a little bit of heartburn over sending my daughter to Europe for a summer just to let her go. And I know she's 20, she'll be 21, but she's still my daughter and so on like that. But she was in Berlin this last summer for a mission trip and actually got connected to a place called Connections, a coffee house bookstore. And it's a bookstore and coffee house. People come in and drink their coffee because everybody drinks coffee, right? Almost everybody drinks coffee. But it's the most widely drank beverage in all the world. And people come in there and they drink coffee. And as they drink coffee, they give them books. And as they give them books, there are books about Jesus. And as these people come in, they begin to develop relationships with them. And the people that come in don't know that it's a church. But it's a church. You see, it's unconventional, but they're looking at being unconventional in an unconventional world so that they might see people come to Christ. David was unconventional. David was confident. David was self-aware. But I'm here to tell you today, what made David a great warrior was not that he was confident. What made David a great warrior was not that he was self-aware. What made David a great warrior was not that he was willing to use a sling and a stone when nobody else had ever done that before. What made David a great warrior is he trusted God. In fact, I want you to read with me a few verses again. Let's go to verse 26. And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" I want you to see the spiritual component here. Get to verse 37. And David said, "The Lord deliver me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, and will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, the Lord be with you." Go to verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come at me with sword and spear and with javelin, but I come at you with the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give you the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, and that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." I want you to see something, and this is our bottom line here today. David approached the physical battle through spiritual eyes. And folks, I think if we can learn anything from David right here, is that he understood what happened in the physical realm is evidence of a deeper spiritual battle that is going on. And I don't know about you, I can get really caught up in looking at all the stuff that is happening and miss the spiritual component to it. In fact, I'll even just tell you, over the last couple of weeks, we've had some wonky stuff happen with some of our electronics. I mean, stuff that it's like crazy. In fact, not to scare y'all, but I came in here one Friday evening a couple weeks ago. We got this new piece of equipment to help it to make sure the lights don't dim. You've been here when the lights dim? So we got this fancy piece of equipment that would help it to where the lights wouldn't dim. I came in here and the whole place was full of smoke. Something went wrong, by the way. Last Sunday, projector went out. We ordered the materials, got everything ready for this projector to be fixed. Wednesday night, I get a phone call. That one's out. I mean, it was just one thing after another after another. And we can get caught up in the physical side of stuff that we sometimes need to realize that there's a spiritual attack going on. I think sometimes we need to realize that that's happening in our marriages. That's happening in our homes. That's happening in our church. It's happening in our world, that there is a spiritual battle that is going on. And if we fail to recognize that, we lose. We're going to always be living in the physical realm of things and always be frustrated. And I'll just tell you, a lot of times what really gives me hope is when all of this junk is going on and just simply acknowledging it as a spiritual battle gives complete, total different perspective on things. And so David was able to see things in a spiritual way. And here's one of the things, folks, I need you to understand more than anything else is that when there's a spiritual battle going on, God cannot lose. God doesn't lose spiritual battles. And we talk about this from the book of Romans. If God is for you, who can be against you? We have to understand that when a spiritual battle is ensuing and we're on God's side, we can't lose. That's what David got. David understood that there was a spiritual battle, that they had God on their side, and he could have gone to Goliath with a Nerf gun. Because God was on his side. Or better yet, David was on God's side. You see, what gave David confidence was trust. I'll go as far as to say it this way. Confidence apart from trust in God is arrogance. Self-awareness apart from trusting God is crippling. You ever been around that person? Unconventional apart from trusting God is going to be reckless. You see, the key component here is trusting God. In fact, I'll tell you, several years ago, I read a book, and it's by Calvin Miller. It's actually a book on David, and it was David's leadership. It's 10 Keys to Servant Leadership, I think is the name of the book. But Calvin Miller basically said this: David never read a leadership book, but yet was a great leader. David was never been to boot camp, never been trained on how to be a warrior, but was a great warrior. You see, what made David great is that he trusted God. What made David great is that he passionately pursued God. The reason why God chose David over Saul is that he basically knew that David was passionately pursuing him. In fact, what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14, God is talking to Saul, and he says, "But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people because you have not kept what the Lord had commanded you." What made David great at this point in time in his life, we're going to look at times where David did not do this. But what made David great at this point in time in his life is that he passionately pursued God. And I think we sometimes miss that. So what do we do from here? What do we do now? I'm going to give you two very quick next steps. One is this: trust God in what He's doing in your life right now. How many of you in the last week or last month, last quarter, last year have asked God why? You don't have to raise your hand, but I know you probably have. You probably asked God, why is this happening in my life? Why is this happening in my children's life? Why is this happening in my marriage? Why is this happening in my health? Why is this happening in my job? Sometimes we don't necessarily like where we are in our lives, and so on. We ask those questions. And so the question is, what is God doing? But what we need to do is trust that God is working now, because I believe the reason why David was so adequately prepared to fight Goliath is that God prepared him in solitude. That at the time that he was a shepherd, the time that he was alone, the time that there was this solitude in his life, God was preparing David for that moment. And so there's a moment in the future. I don't know what that moment is, but there's a moment in your future that God is preparing you for right now. So trust that God can do this. But also, let me just say this: above everything else, before anything else, pursue God. Now, I could spend hours talking about what it means to pursue God, but I'm just going to give you an illustration of my own life. In my own life, there's been many times that I have been convicted. Anybody ever been convicted that you just need to do something different in your life? And like I'm convicted to say, I need to be a better husband. I need to be a better father. I need to be a better leader. I need to be a better preacher. I need to be a better minister. All those sort of things. You probably don't say you need to be a better preacher. And that's probably not anything in your life. But there's certain things. So what do I do, or what do people do when you say, I need to be better at? If you want to be better at it as a parent, what do? You ingest Dobson. You know, you start reading James Dobson, and you start reading all these books, and you try to become this great parent and so on like that. And so that's what we would say you got to do. And if you want to be a better spouse, in fact, I'll tell you, in a couple of weeks, actually next Sunday, we're going to be starting a love and respect class here at the church, and it's going to talk about being a husband and talk about being a wife, and those are good things, and we encourage you to do that. But maybe there's something else that needs to be done as well. Say, I need to be a better Christian. I need to be a better this. And we read all the books, and we go to all the conferences, and we go to podcasts and blogs and all these different things. I think we need to take a page out of David's book. You see, David never read leadership books. He was a great leader. Didn't go figure out how to do battle. He just passionately pursued God. Maybe he should have taken some of those parenting classes. We're going to get to that in David's life. But the reality is, before anything, David passionately pursued God. I mean, I'd like to encourage you more than anything else. In fact, that's the very first value that we kind of lay out, is just pursue God. Find a way to be connected to Him. Will you join me in prayer? Father God in heaven, I thank you for this day. God, I glorify you and I praise you for your servant David. And Lord, I pray for this journey over the next several weeks that we might dive deep and dig in on who David is, but more importantly than who, how you would like to transform us as a result of David's life. Thank you in Jesus' name.